Recorded for Radio Free Maine by Roger Leisner.
Of a week and a half tour of both the West Coast and the East Coast of the United States. They come from Colombia. They started their tour on Wednesday in Los Angeles, and they have been involved in protests against the FTAA in Los Angeles, and have also participated in protesting against the stockholders meeting at the Occidental Petroleum Company. We also are privileged to have with us Professor Noam Chomsky tonight from MIT. He will be the first speaker for us tonight, and he's probably somebody who doesn't need an introduction. But since I was honored to be asked to do it, let me attempt to describe what a rare individual I believe Noam Chomsky to be. Over the course of nearly half a century, the scholarly contributions of Professor Chomsky have fundamentally shifted the way scholars think about language, and by implication, the way that we think about our minds. He is known for championing the classical idea of innate mental mechanisms and hypothesizing the details of a universal human grammar, a genetically determined species-specific unconscious knowledge about language. Along the way, he helped to deflate the dominance of behaviorism. He is a co-founder of the field now known as cognitive science, and his work has heavily impacted the fields of linguistics, psychology, philosophy, and others. All the while, he has dedicated most of his energies to unscrambling and pointing to the abuse of power and the lies of our government, in print and in talks like these to millions of students and other individuals around the world. His busy typewriters produced more than 80 books and more than 1,000 articles over his extensive career. For many years, he has been the most cited living author in the world, and yet an activist who has given voice to people who otherwise would be silenced. I've never been a student at MIT, so I don't know how things work here exactly. But at the university down the road, I know that most well-known professors are pretty hard to get a hold of, even if you're taking their class. But on this count, Professor Chomsky is rare in that he takes innumerable hours to meet with and correspond not only with his students, but also anyone who calls on him. It is an honor and a privilege to introduce Professor Noam Chomsky.
Thanks. The focus of the evening is the speakers who follow. I'm going to make sure to keep me within my allotted time. The primary focus of the evening, as you know, is the struggle of the Uwa people to control their own land, resources, and fate. They'll be talking about that. I'll say a couple of words about the more general context in which I think this fits. It is, of course, part of a much broader struggle, a struggle which actually goes through history as to who is going to control land, resources, and the fate of people. In the modern era, the question, to put it pretty starkly and in straight English instead of complicated terminology which can obfuscate it, the question is that to be in the hands of persons, the kind of people who bleed when you cut them, or is it to be in the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies, which are fundamentally totalitarian institutions, which have been established by radical judicial activism in the last century, and administer markets, control governments, and intend, of course, to control the land, resources, and fates of persons of flesh and blood. In recent, what are mislabeled free trade agreements, don't have much to do with free trade, these, like NAFTA or the FTA that's coming up, these tyrannical institutions have been granted rights that go way beyond persons. They would have scandalized any classical liberal like, say, Adam Smith. So that's the question, stark question. The questions is arising in Quebec. It's arising a couple of miles down the road where Harvard students are engaged in civil disobedience, calling on the richest university in the world to pay a living wage to staff and workers, which they refuse to do or even negotiate about. And in fact, it's all over. This, as I say, this struggle goes back through history. It took a pretty stark turn in about the end of the Second World War, especially for Latin America. At the end of the Second World War, as you know, the United States had a position of absolutely overwhelming global power. There'd never been anything like it in history. It understood that. Planners carefully assigned to every area of the world what they called its function. So the function of Southeast Asia was to provide resources and raw materials to the rich industrial countries that are their former colonial masters. The function of, and the United States, of course, the function of Africa was to be exploited, which is the word that was used, for the reconstruction of Europe. The function of the Middle East was the U.S. was going to take that over and run the world's energy resources. With regard to Latin America, in fact, the Western Hemisphere, the United States simply decided it was in a position, finally, to kick out its major enemies, namely France and Britain, and to take the whole continent over. It would be our little region over here, as the Secretary of War put it, where nobody's going to disturb us. Exactly, but there were some problems. The problems were the population of Latin America didn't quite see things this way. That came to a head in February 1945 at a conference in Chapultepec, Mexico, where the United States imposed, essentially by force, what was called the Charter of the Americas. The Charter of the Americas, there was a conflict. The Charter of the Americas said committed the countries of Latin America, and it's not that they had a choice, it's committed them to what's called an end to economic nationalism in all its forms. Economic nationalism means independent development. So an end to independent development in all its forms. Now, we have the internal State Department records from those days. They've been declassified for a long time. You can read all about it, maybe not in your history book, but in the documentary record. The State Department recognized the problem. They said that the problem is what they call the spread over Latin America of the philosophy of the new nationalism, which was calling for a broader distribution of wealth and raising the living standards of the masses, was calling for independent development and industrialization. These are quotes, incidentally, but was based on the principle that the first beneficiaries of a country's resources should be the people of that country. And of course, none of this is allowed. So we have to beat back the philosophy of the new nationalism and make it very clear that there's going to be no independent development. There won't be any excessive industrial development, as the Truman and Eisenhower administrations put it. Excessive meant in competition with the United States, like Brazil could produce cheap steel that the U.S. didn't want to produce if it liked, but got to be within the framework of U.S. power. Certainly we cannot accept the principle about broader distribution of wealth and raising the living standards of the masses, and surely not the principle that the first beneficiary of the people's resources should be the people of that country. They have to be U.S. investors and their equivalents elsewhere. Well, as I say, the U.S. simply imposed that, and a good deal of the history of the last half century or so is the struggle in Latin America and the United States is the struggle over this. The U.S. at that point was able to implement the Monroe Doctrine. Not the Monroe Doctrine in the pretty words you learn, but the Monroe Doctrine as it was intended. And we know that too from internal records that have been made public. For example, of the Wilson administration. Woodrow Wilson privately, in discussion with his Secretary of State, explained that the purpose of the Monroe Doctrine it implies that the U.S. will pursue its own interests. The interests of others, he said, are an incident, not an end. they benefit, okay. If they're harmed, it's okay. But they're not like human beings who are an end in themselves. The rest of the world, the people of Latin America, are an incident. He agreed, Woodrow Wilson, that it would be, as he put it, impolitic to let this be made public, and it wasn't, and it still isn't. I mean, technically it is, but you have to work to find it. But that's what it meant. And of course, that's what it always meant, and that's what it means today. And the Chapultepec Conference simply spelled it out. When he says, when they talk about the interests of the United States, remember, they don't mean the people of the United States. The people of the United States are also not to be the first beneficiaries of any country's resources, and the people of the United States are also an incident, not an end. The United States means the powerful institutions that run the United States. There's a name for this position, incidentally. It's called Wilsonian idealism, that you do read about. Wilson was very realistic. I mean, I mention him because he's sort of the prototype of idealism, but it's the same wherever you look. He was a progressive, meaning he was very strongly in support of what was called the corporatization of America that was going on around the turn of the century. And he understood what it was. He said, this is the end of any individual economic freedom in the United States, entrepreneurship, capitalism, the old sense, gone. He said, from now on, he said, from now on, men will be servants of corporations. Corporations will be unaccountable institutions. As I said, they were granted the rights of persons by the courts. Actually, it was their management which was granted that right. They're as powerful as government, he said. Actually, they are government, he might have said. That's in the economic life. In the political side, the Wilsonian liberal intellectuals held that the population have to stay out of public affairs. They have to be spectators, not participants, basically none of their business. This is the foundation of modern political science in many ways. And it goes right up to the present. So that's Wilsonian idealism, and it's implemented repeatedly. People remain an incident, not an end, whether they're the people here or the people anywhere else. And that, too, has plenty of struggle. Right after the Second World War, there was a major campaign undertaken in the United States to break down labor rights, to attack popular democracy, in general, to restore business rule. That's a struggle that goes on to the present. I mentioned 2 examples of it. Well, who's going to control who are going to be the first beneficiaries of resources, land, anything, and who's going to control the fate of the population? That's exactly the struggle that continues. So take the FTAA. The story, it's all what's going on in Quebec. The picture is that, the noble leaders of the hemisphere, led by our own magnificent leader of the Holy State, are struggling for democracy, rights, economic growth, all kind of wonderful things. In a kind of a technical sense, those reports, which is like close to 100% of the media, for M.I.T. students, that carries no information in the technical sense. There's a technical sense of information in which something carries information if it's not predictable. If it's predictable, it carries no information. Since this is totally predictable, whether it's Stalinist Russia or the United States or anyone else, all of that stuff carries no information. What does carry information is what's happening. So if you want to figure out what the commitment to democracy is, then you ask some simple questions, like who knows what's being discussed? There's a supposedly 250-page agreement being discussed. Who's seen it? Well, in fact, it's been around. There are plenty of people who've seen it. It's accessible to the CEOs of major corporations. who've been involved in the planning. It's available to the trade ministers of governments. Trade ministers of governments have essentially nothing to do with the government. Most people don't even know who they are. They're representatives of corporate power. It's available to the media, of course, but they understand very well that they better not let anybody know about it. And in fact, nobody does know. In fact, you can find out about it, but only if you work. You really have to work to find out about it. The provisions of the several hundred-page document have not been made public, and ultimately they will technically be public. They'll be hidden somewhere on the internet and some web, and that'll mean they're available to some minuscule proportion of the population who has the time and the energy and the knowledge and the resources and so on to try to find out what's going on in the world. But effectively, nobody knows about it. And that's the meaning of democracy. And in fact, it is the meaning of democracy. And furthermore, the public's well aware of it. Nobody's confused about this. So the United States is a democracy, but the population doesn't think so. So take the last election. I'm talking about the period right immediately before the election, so nothing about vote tampering in Florida. Before the election, in fact, for the year before, approximately 75% of the population didn't think there was an election at all. It's not that they weren't aware of it. I mean, you couldn't turn on a tube and not be aware of it. You're deluged with it. But they didn't regard it as an election. They regarded, we have careful polling results. They regard it as a game played by rich contributors, party bosses, the media, and the public relations industry who craft candidates in such a way that maybe somebody will agree to vote for them. But you can't believe a word they say, obviously. They're creations of the public relations industry. You can't believe a word they say, even if you can understand it. And most people have recognized you can't understand it. And it's designed so that you won't understand it. So it's very hard to figure out where anybody stands on anything. And that's on purpose. The goal in PR lingo is to have people focus on what are called qualities, not issues. Issues are off the agenda. In particular, if the issues happen to have the property that the business world is on one side and the population's on another side. And there are many issues like that. For example, the FTAA. One of the reasons it's kept secret is because everyone understands if the public finds out about it, they're not going to like it. That's recognized very frankly. So it has to be kept secret. And there was no talk about it in the election. Although it's obviously a major issue. Economic issues are of extreme importance to the population. The most important one has actually been the trade deficit, because people understand that when there's a trade, say when we have a huge trade deficit with Mexico, it's not Mexican industry that's exporting to the United States, it's U.S. industry. And that's affecting their job security, job quality, and so on, and they're concerned about it. They don't care one way or another about the budget, the federal budget. If you look at the campaign issues, tremendous focus on the budget, nothing about the trade deficit or capital mobility altogether. And again, for the same reason, population's on one side, the business community, the guys who are supposed to run the place, are on the other side. Even small, simple, straightforward information is suppressed with pretty amazing efficiency. So one major issue in the FTAA controversy is what about rights for people, like labor rights? Should there be labor rights? Well, there was just last week a major report published by Human Rights Watch, not exactly an obscure organization, on what has happened to labor rights under NAFTA. Clinton was compelled, in order to ram the thing through, to put in some meaningless verbiage about labor rights. And the other governments had to too, or there was an explosion in their hands. So there is stuff on labor rights. But like other human rights conventions, universally, they have no teeth. human rights conventions are very different from investor rights conventions. Investor rights agreements have teeth. You've got to adhere to them or else, and there are harsh sanctions. Human rights conventions, do what you feel like, nice words. You can use them against enemies sometimes. And the labor rights and environmental rights components of NAFTA were like that. So workers in Mexico can, call hearings under NAFTA and protest vigorously against the way they're treated, and the Human Rights Report gives many examples. But then they ask, well, what's been done about this? The answer is zero. Nothing's been done. Furthermore, they point out that all three governments have committed themselves to try to undermine these rights, even to the extent that they're on paper. Well, that's kind of important, and it's highly relevant to what's going on in Quebec. As of this afternoon, it's been mentioned in the United States in one newspaper, in an op-ed in a small local paper in Madison, Wisconsin. You can read it in the British Financial Times, the world's major business journal. You can read it in the Spanish press and so on, but not here. The population is just too dangerous. They better not know things like this. They've got to listen to the propaganda that's called democracy. Part of the debate, as you know, has to do with what used to be called fast track. It's now got some new Orwellian term, I forget what, trade enhancement, something or other. But what it means is the population is kept out of any international economic agreement. It can go to Congress, but they just got to say yes or no, which means yes. No discussion and nothing for the public. This is considered extremely crucial. There's near unanimity in elite circles, including the press, that you've got to have fast-track legislation. Otherwise, the president will not be able to negotiate what's called free trade. Notice that this has nothing to do with free trade. What it has to do with is democracy. You can be the most passionate advocate of free trade and opposed to this if you believe that people have a right to determine their own fate. They know what's going on. If you think that people shouldn't have a right to have a role in determining their own fate, then you're in favor of totalitarianism, naturally. You want the executive to make decisions and have Parliament rubber stamp them. Stalin would have clapped. This would have nothing to do with free trade, even if the agreements were free trade agreements, which they're not. They're investor rights agreements, which is a totally different thing. But they got to be rammed through without discussion in Congress or certainly among the public, because otherwise we won't have democracy. And there's a reason for this. And the business press, again, is pretty frank about it. So a couple of years ago, fast-track legislation came up in Congress. The press was 100% in favor, the business world totally in favor, the government in favor, everybody in favor. Was considered what's called a no-brainer. It's so obvious, you just have to pass it. Well, they couldn't ram it through. People all over the country were beating down the doors of their local representative and saying, we want to know what's going on, and they just had to vote it down. The Wall Street Journal had an interesting article afterwards. They were very depressed, like everyone respectable. But they said, we really have a problem. They said the opponents, they say obviously this is a great thing, but the opponents have what they called an ultimate weapon, namely the population's against it. And therefore, the only way to, if it's a totalitarian state, it wouldn't make any difference. Anybody talks, throw them in a torture chamber. But in a more free society, it's a problem. And the way to deal with it is silence. Control information, make sure nobody knows. Then you can have a democracy. It will be wonderful. I could easily go on, but that's the kind of democracy that's being imposed. In fact, if you really, this is only the surface, if you look at the terms of the agreement, which of course nobody's being told about, but we know a fair amount about, they're just a further attack on democracy. As the whole neoliberal assault has been for the last 25 years. What's called globalization, again, has nothing to do with that. Liberalization of capital, which is the main part, was intended to undermine democracy. It's well understood, there's no debate about it, that if you free up capital flow, that restricts the capacity of governments to make decisions, because it puts decisions into the hands of investors and lenders. They don't like some policy, they destroy the currency. That's why the post-war economic system, 1945, which was constructed at a time of major mass popular commitment, anti-fascist, resistance forces, social democratic, and so on, simply had to build in financial regulation. It incidentally led to the greatest period of economic growth in human history, way beyond the period of the last 25 years, which has been very slow in comparison. It even led to a faster growth of trade than during the globalization period. And it also led to gave the opportunity for social democratic measures. So, benefits, welfare, and so on. The liberalization of capital about 25 years ago was designed to reverse that, and it has. Since that time, there's been significant slowdown in economic growth in every part of the world that adhered to the rules, and other macroeconomic measures, but also an attack on democracy. We're all familiar with it, because it simply moves decisions into other hands, private, unaccountable hands. One crucial part of the FTAA is called the Agreement on Trade and Services. Trade and services has absolutely nothing to do with trade. The word trade is thrown in all of these things, so you can somehow put it under a trade agreement. What this means is services is essentially everything, like education, health, postal service, transportation, anything that might be in the public arena is services. The agreement on trade and services means that this stuff has to be open to private takeover. It has to be, and there's a technique that's been worked out, again, by radical judicial activists who call themselves conservatives, but, again, people who wrote the Constitution would tear their hair out. They have extended, there's a clause in the Bill of Rights, Fifth Amendment, called the Takings Clause. What it says, in effect, is that if the government, takes your backyard for a road, they have to compensate you. That's the Takings Clause. In the last 15 years or so, that's been extended by courts and lawyers, not by legislation, to what's called regulatory taking. It means that if a government regulation on, let's say, wages or environment or rights of women or anything, if that regulation, which in a more or less democratic state means some public decision, if that regulation interferes with potential profit, then that's tantamount to expropriation. It's the phrase that's used. It's called a regulatory taking under the new interpretation of the Takings Clause. That means almost anything that people decide in any domain, services is very broad, can be regarded as expropriation, tantamount to expropriation. Hence, an interference with rights of corporations under NAFTA are allowed to sue governments. People aren't. And they can sue governments for expropriation, meaning doing something that'll harm potential profits. That then goes to a secret panel of lawyers and business representatives who come down with a decision, and you can take a genius to figure out what the decision is going to be, and that's what it is in case after case. And the idea, again, is simply to undermine and eliminate the public arena. That's a crucial part of the NAFTA agreement. Notice that this stuff has the FTAA agreement has nothing to do with trade, but it's very important that the public not know about it. This expansion of regulatory takings could never be rammed through legislatures because they'd never get it through. So the idea is to sneak it into international agreements where it'll be binding on governments because this power behind it, and if you got to do it, it's called the treaty, and got to do it. Notice that the powerful governments do it only when they feel like it. Like if Bill Clinton wants to bar Japanese supercomputers, because U.S. computer makers can't compete with them. Yeah, just goes ahead and does it. Nobody can do anything about it. These are weapons for the powerful. Powerful, again, doesn't mean powerful countries. It means powerful institutions working against their own people as well as everyone else. Well, that's the core of the issue, in my opinion. The struggle of the UA people is a particular part of it. People who are trying to control their own land and resources and fate, but that's just symbolic of a struggle we're all engaged in.
We'll have a question and answer period after all three speakers have spoken. The next speaker is Armando Balbuena. He is a leader of the National Indigenous Organization of Colombia.
Aquí la ponemos, sí. Okay.
Colombia hoy está en una guerra civil
Today, Colombia is in a civil war
donde los medios de comunicación han dado a conocer ante la humanidad
which the press has reported to humanity
como causa principal de la guerra el narcotráfico.
as really being caused by drug trafficking.
La guerra civil en Colombia no tiene nada que ver con el narcotráfico.
But the civil war in Colombia really has nothing to do with drug trafficking.
Pero los medios de comunicación le han impuesto a todos los ciudadanos del mundo que el problema es el narcotráfico.
But the media of the world imposes on the consciousness of humanity this understanding of the civil war.
Los UA y los pueblos indígenas son las causas esenciales de la guerra civil en Colombia.
The UA people and the other indigenous peoples of Colombia are really the cause of the war in Colombia.
El NAFTA, el ALCA, el Mercosur, el Pacto Andino son otros ingredientes más necesarios del gobierno de los Estados Unidos.
And the United States also uses NAFTA and the FTTA and Mercosur and the Andean Pact for this purpose.
Sobre y debajo de los territorios de los pueblos indígenas están los recursos mineros y energéticos, al igual que los bancos genéticos y los bancos de agua necesarios para las empresas multinacionales.
On and under the territories of the indigenous peoples are the vast deposits of natural resources and energy resources and genetic resources and water tables.
Que los ministros de Minas y Energía de Colombia y los presidentes y expresidentes declaren ante los medios que es mejor acabar a 5.000 UAS para el desarrollo industrial de Colombia. Hace muchos años se le llamaba fascismo.
So when the ministers of mines and energy of Colombia and the ex-presidents and present presidents tells the media that it's necessary to wipe out 5,000 UA in name of the industrial development of Colombia, this is what they're doing.
A Adolfo Hitler se le decía que era fascista.
Hitler said that he was a fascist.
Hoy, ¿cómo se le dice al señor Andrés Pastrana, que es designado por el gobierno de los Estados Unidos como la representación democrática de Sudamérica?
What can we say that Mr. Andrés Pastrana who has been designated as the representative of democracy in Colombia by the United States?
Estamos convencidos los pueblos indígenas que son las mismas cosas que es el mismo norte de cómo acabar a los pueblos indígenas mediante la segregación racial, el etnocidio. Eso es fascismo.
The indigenous peoples are convinced that really what we're looking at is the same phenomenon and the same strategy to wipe out the indigenous peoples. And this is ethnocide, this is genocide, and this is fascism.
Ya empezó el desarrollo del Plan Colombia para con el pueblo colombiano y empieza a confeccionarse lo que es el Plan Andino.
They've already started implementing the Plan Colombia, and they're working on the Plan Andino.
Para todo el mundo, como para las Naciones Unidas, al igual que el gobierno de los Estados Unidos, es conocido que el paramilitarismo, quien realiza las matanzas colectivas y selectivas, es impulsado por el gobierno colombiano.
It's common knowledge for everyone, including the United Nations and the U.S. government, that the paramilitary are the authors and perpetrators of the collective and individual killings and massacres in Colombia.
El Plan Colombia es una estrategia paramilitar para el desplazamiento de los campesinos.
Plan Colombia is a paramilitary strategy to displace the campesinos.
Las fumigaciones contra la planta de coca están cumpliendo un papel fundamental. En Colombia se fumiga a la selva, a las personas y a los alimentos.
The fumigations of the coca leaf play an important role. In Colombia, they're fumigating the rainforest, the people, and our food.
Con la disculpa de fumigar los cultivos de coca y amapola,
with the excuse of spraying and fumigating the coca leaf and the poppy fields,
los desplazamientos de campesinos se han incrementado.
The internal displacement of the campesinos has soared.
Porque además de fumigar pequeños cultivos de coca para las subsistencias,
Because in addition to spraying and fumigating the small-scale local coca harvests,
estos se encuentran rodeados de pequeñas parcelas para el alimento cotidiano.
they're also spraying the small parcels and gardens of food of the campesinos.
Se perjudica la autonomía alimentaria del campesinado.
So the food autonomy or food security of the campesinos is threatened and undermined.
Se fumiga a los campesinos que viven en las zonas.
The campesinos who live in these areas are being sprayed.
Se fumiga a los indígenas dueños de los territorios.
The indigenous peoples who are the owners of these territories are also sprayed and fumigated.
Esto nos representa a nosotros enfermedades,
This causes sickness amongst our peoples,
abortos,
abortions,
nacimiento de niños deformes,
and the birth of deformed children,
contaminación de las aguas,
the pollution of our waters,
cambio en el clima.
climate change.
El gobierno colombiano está fumigando donde no existen cultivos ilícitos.
And furthermore, the Colombian government is also spraying where there are no illicit crops.
Pero principalmente está fumigando la selva.
But especially they're spraying the rainforest.
Las fumigaciones es una forma de guerra que se ejerce contra la población.
These fumigations are a form of war against the civilian population.
En esto no nos equivocamos.
We must be clear about this. Make no mistake.
Más del 90% de las riquezas que se producen por narcotráfico se quedan en los bancos de los Estados Unidos.
90% of the wealth generated from drug trafficking is in the banks of the United States.
En Colombia solo se queda un 6% de las riquezas que se producen.
Only 6% stays in Colombia.
El país que menos interés tiene en acabar los cultivos de la coca y amapola es Estados Unidos.
So the country that's least interested in really getting rid of the illicit cultivation of coca and poppies is the United States.
Sin embargo, les interesa apropiarse de la explotación extensiva del campo.
Nonetheless, they do want to expropriate vast tracts of the countryside
Incrementar su poder sobre las naciones,
and increase their power over the nation state
e imponer su ideología en el NAFTA, en el TLC y en todos los demás formas de comercio internacional.
and impose their ideology through all of the different free trade agreements like NAFTA and the FTAA.
Es esta una guerra contra la soberanía alimentaria.
This is a war against the sovereignty of our food security.
Para poder hacer más dependiente a un pueblo, no basta con la propiedad sobre la tierra.
They want to make us more dependent, and they want to do this not just by controlling the property of land.
Es necesario eliminar todo vínculo espiritual de conocimiento de los campesinos e indígenas con la tierra.
They also want to wipe out and eliminate all of our spiritual relationship and link to the land of the campesinos and the indigenous peoples.
Es por ello que el Estado colombiano desarrolla la campaña de destrucción de aquello que mantiene viva la existencia de las comunidades rurales.
That's why the Colombian state is developing a plan to attack all of the sustenance of the life of the communities.
Las huertas tradicionales de pan coger,
The traditional orchards,
el cuidado del medio ambiente,
the way that we take care of the environment,
la protección de los nacimientos de agua,
the way that we care for the water sources,
el equilibrio entre producción y medio ambiente,
and the delicate balance between production and the ecosystems,
el vínculo entre las cosechas y el cosmos,
the link between the harvest and the universe,
el control de plagas con fumigantes naturales,
the way that we control pests in our agriculture with natural spraying.
alimentos como el frijol y sus diferentes variedades,
Food like the beans and all of its different strains,
el maíz y sus variedades,
corn and all of its varieties,
el trigo, la racacha y sus variedades,
wheat and the aracache and all of its varieties,
la patata, la papa, la yuca y el ñame,
the potatoes, yuca, the ñame,
las legumbres, arvejas y toda clase de plantas medicinales,
the vegetables and beans and all types of medical plants,
y otros frutales de diversa naturaleza,
and other fruits of different varieties.
son los peores enemigos de las multinacionales.
All of this diversity are among the worst enemies of the multinationals.
Son los peores enemigos de las biotecnologías.
They're the worst enemies of the ideologies.
Si los pueblos indígenas y los campesinos
If the indigenous people and the campesinos
continuamos resistiendo,
continue to resist,
es porque poco a poco nos seguimos resistiendo
it's because little by little we continue to resist.
y cada día con más fuerza
And each day with greater strength,
que hay que cuidar las semillas
we take care of our seeds
y además cuidar la tierra,
and we take care of the earth,
cuidar el agua.
the water.
Es por ello que los indígenas en Colombia
That's why the indigenous people in Colombia
es el objetivo principal de las multinacionales.
are one of the principal targets of the multinationals.
Es el enemigo principal del ALCA, el NAFTA o el Mercosur.
We are the principal enemy of NAFTA or Mercosur or the FTAA.
Somos los enemigos del gobierno de los Estados Unidos,
We are the enemies of the government of the United States
ya que debajo de nuestro suelo
because on and under and above our land
están los recursos naturales,
are the natural resources,
están las minas
are the mines,
y están los recursos energéticos,
and that's also where the genetic resources are found.
están los bancos genéticos,
And that's where the biodiversity and the genetic banks are,
están los bancos de agua.
and the aquifers and water systems.
$1 vale 2.250 pesos.
¿Cuántos? 2,000?
2.250 pesos.
$1 is worth 2,250 pesos in Colombia.
Un litro de gasolina vale menos de 500 pesos.
A liter of gasoline costs a little less than 500 pesos.
En Bogotá, un litro de agua vale 3.200 pesos.
But in Bogotá, a liter of water costs 3,200 pesos.
Es más barato consumir gasolina que consumir agua.
It's cheaper to drink water. It's cheaper to drink gasoline than water.
Queremos decirle a ustedes, ciudadanos de Estados Unidos,
We'd like to say to you, citizens of the United States,
que los medios de comunicación nos han enseñado otras cosas de ustedes,
that the media has also told us a different story about you,
pero que también comprendemos el comportamiento humano por la existencia, por la vida y por la dignidad de los pueblos.
but we're very clear about the human behavior of helping and being in favor of our peoples.
Que ustedes no son iguales al señor que gobierna,
You are obviously not the same as a person who governs you.
que ustedes no son iguales a Novartis,
You are not the same as Novartis.
que ustedes no son iguales a las empresas multinacionales,
You're not the same as the multinationals.
que ustedes no son iguales a la OTSI.
You're not the same as Occidental Petroleum.
Los pueblos indígenas en Colombia
The indigenous people in Colombia
pueden desaparecer con el Plan Colombia aprobado por el Senado de los Estados Unidos.
may be exterminated by Plan Colombia, which was approved by the U.S. Congress.
Hemos conocido en el mundo la situación del pueblo Uwa.
The case and struggle of the Uwa people is known throughout the world.
Pero cuando se explotó el caucho, se asesinaron más de 40.000 indígenas huitotos.
But when rubber was extracted, 40,000 Witoto indigenous people were killed.
Hay 2 pozos de petróleo en Colombia
There are 2 oil sites in Colombia
que producen el 4% del Producto Interno Bruto.
that produce 4% of the gross national product.
Esos pozos fueron explorados por una empresa de nombre Texas Petroleum Company.
These oil wells were drilled by a company called Texas Petroleum Company.
Fue en los años que a los indios se les cazaba, se les asesinaba, se les envenenaba, apoyado por el ejército y la policía colombiana.
These wells were drilled in the years when indigenous people were hunted down and assassinated and poisoned by the government and army of Colombia.
los procesos jurídicos de aquel entonces que se discutieron en el Senado, en los medios y en los juzgados.
And the court cases that were discussed in the Senate in Colombia and in the courts and in the press.
Y ese resultado fue que no se les condenó a los asesinos de indios
Didn't result in sentences of and convictions of the assassins of the indigenous peoples,
ya que el argumento de los jueces
because the judges argued
es que los asesinos no sabían que ellos eran personas.
in their acquittal that the assassins didn't know that indigenous people were persons.
Eso fue en 1968 a 1972.
And this was in the years 1968 to 1970.
Es eso muy reciente.
This is quite recent.
Los UWA es la misma situación, la estamos viviendo.
The UWA are facing a similar situation.
En Colombia hay un pueblo indígena de nombre los Chimilas.
In Colombia, there's an indigenous people called the Chamilas.
Solamente quedan vivos 1.224 personas.
There are only 1,224 Chamila people left.
Están secuestrados por las fuerzas paramilitares apoyados por el gobierno hace 5 años.
They're under siege by the paramilitary groups with support from the government in the last 5 years.
Cuando se asesina a un dirigente indígena,
When an indigenous leader is assassinated,
se extermina a un pueblo.
you're exterminating an indigenous people.
Porque un indígena es aprender toda su cultura,
Because an indigenous person has to learn all about their culture
y mantener la dignidad de su cultura
and protect the dignity of that culture
para aprender también de la otra,
so that they can then learn about other cultures,
para poder discutir con los gobiernos, con los empresarios, con la guerrilla, con los paramilitares.
so that they can negotiate and discuss with the government and the multinationals and the guerrilla in defense of their peoples.
Para llegar a ese nivel se necesitan muchos años de formación y dignidad.
But for an indigenous person to achieve that knowledge and that capacity, it requires many, many years of formation and education and dignity.
Entonces, cuando se asesina a un dirigente indígena de solo 1.600 personas,
So when an indigenous leader of an indigenous people of only 1,600 people is assassinated,
la agresión es muy fuerte.
it's a very terrible aggression.
A este pueblo de los Chimilas solamente le queda un interlocutor.
The Chamila people have only one leader left.
Y en esa situación se encuentran más de 62 pueblos indígenas en la Amazonía colombiana.
And there's 62 indigenous people in the Colombian Amazon that are in similar situations.
Allí donde el gobierno de los Estados Unidos empezó el Plan Colombia.
And that area is precisely where the U.S. government started implementing Plan Colombia.
Ese Plan Colombia que fue coadyuvado por los altos funcionarios de la Occidental de Colombia que quiere aplastar y acabar a los UWA.
And this Plan Colombia was helped by the lobbying efforts of Occidental Petroleum, who are intent on wiping out the UWA people.
Los lazos nuestros de los pueblos indígenas con ustedes, de los ciudadanos de los Estados Unidos,
The links and connections between the indigenous peoples and you, the people of the United States,
es fortalecernos cada vez más,
strengthens us each day.
es comprendernos cada vez más,
It helps us to understand each other
es luchar por nuestra dignidad de persona humana
and to struggle for our dignity as people.
y entre todos ganar,
And together we can win.
como lo están haciendo muchos en Quebec,
Together like those that are protesting in Quebec.
Los ánimos son para ustedes también.
I want to fortify your morale.
También es fuerza para nosotros.
That also fortifies our spirit.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much.
The next speaker is a head of state, but you won't see any bodyguards around here. His name is Roberto Perez. He is the president of the traditional authorities of the Uwa people. And I forgot to mention earlier that the person who's doing an excellent job of translating is Cassandra Smithies.
Tinjaro, bueno. Estoy diciendo que muy buenas tardes, hermanos y hermanas de estadounidenses.
I'm saying in my language, good afternoon, brothers and sisters of the United States.
Mi nombre es Roberto Pérez, soy presidente del Cabildo Mayor de la Asociación de Autoridades Tradicionales UA en Colombia.
My name is Roberto Perez. I'm the president and representative of the Association of Traditional Authorities of the Uwa People of Colombia.
Somos descendencia de la resistencia de más de 500 años en defensa de la lucha por la tierra.
We're descendants of the resistance of more than 500 years, resistance that defends the struggle for land.
La lucha de los pueblos indígenas en Colombia sigue defendiendo por recuperación del territorio.
The struggle of the indigenous people in Colombia continues for recovering our land and territories.
Nosotros somos una nación y somos soberanos en nuestro territorio. Y nosotros tenemos forma de gobernar, tenemos nuestra propia cultura, nuestra propia identidad y nuestros propios valores.
We are a sovereign nation and we govern in our territory. We have our own form of government, our own culture, our own identity, and our own values.
Nosotros, como pueblo indígena UA, a pesar de que hemos pasado más de 500 años de resistencia, hoy mantenemos nuestra riqueza, que es la riqueza cultural.
We, the indigenous people, the Uwa, continue, even after 500 years, to preserve our greatest wealth, which is our culture.
Para nosotros, una comunidad o un pueblo indígena sin cultura no tiene valor, no tiene identidad.
For us, an indigenous community that doesn't have their culture is really without an identity, without any value.
Nosotros lo que estamos defendiendo para el mundo, no solamente para los UAs.
What we're defending not just for the Uwa, but for the world.
Llevamos 9 años de confrontación en contra de la política del gobierno y contra la OCDE.
We've been struggling for 9 years against the policies of the Colombian government and against Occidental Petroleum.
Para los pueblos indígenas, la tierra es nuestra madre, ella es la que da la vida, ella es la que da de comer, de ella vivimos.
For the indigenous peoples, the earth is our mother. She gives us life, she gives us food, she gives us our sustenance.
De acuerdo a nuestros principios culturales, de acuerdo a nuestras leyes naturales, que el petróleo para nosotros es la sangre de nuestra madre tierra y es el equilibrio del mundo y la naturaleza.
According to our cultural principles and natural laws, oil for us is the blood of Mother Earth and maintains the balance of the earth.
Nosotros pensamos diferente lo que piensa la sociedad colombiana. El pensamiento de los pueblos indígenas es respetar a la naturaleza, respetar al agua, a los árboles, todo lo que se encuentra rodea en nuestro territorio.
We think differently from the rest of Colombian society. Our way of thinking as indigenous people is to respect nature, to respect the waters, to respect the trees, and to respect all the forms of life that are in our territories.
El agua es el fuente de vida de toda la humanidad. Por eso hay que defenderlo.
Water is the fountain of life of all of humanity. That's why we must defend the water.
Cuando mi gobierno, mi jefe, mi autoridad tradicional decidió en 1992, de acuerdo a nuestros principios culturales, de acuerdo a nuestras leyes de la naturaleza, decir al gobierno, decir a la compañía multinacional, no a la exploración petrolera en nuestro territorio ancestral.
When my government, that is, when my traditional authorities decided in 1992 that according to our natural principles and laws, we must say no to oil exploration in our territories, to the Colombian government and Occidental Petroleum.
En 1991, el pueblo indígena, por medio de nuestras luchas, por medio de la resistencia, hemos logrado algunos derechos en la nueva constitución política del país.
In 1991, the indigenous peoples of Colombia, through our struggles, achieved a number of triumphs in the constitutional reform.
Pero esas leyes logradas no se practican, se viola el mismo gobierno.
But these laws, unfortunately, are dead letter because the government itself violates them.
Nosotros estamos luchando por el reconocimiento por nuestros territorios, el reconocimiento del derecho a la vida y derecho a la cultura.
We are struggling for recognition, for the recognition of our territories, for the recognition of our right to life.
Para nosotros el gobierno no es el dueño del subsuelo.
For us, the government is not the owner of the subsurface.
El gobierno solamente que está administrando al país.
The government is really only supposed to administer the country.
Los dueños somos los indígenas y campesinos, el pueblo pobre.
The owners of the country are the indigenous peoples, the campesinos, and the poor.
Por eso hoy decimos al gobierno que el gobierno no es el el dueño del territorio de los indígenas.
That's why we say to the government that they are not the owners of the indigenous people's territories.
Las leyes hacen, pero para destruir al pueblo, de acuerdo a los intereses que maneja el poder.
Laws are drafted to destroy our peoples according to the interests of the powerful.
La posición de nosotros como pueblo indígenas es, algún día tenemos que decir al mundo que nos acompañe, que nos solidarice con nosotros, porque no solamente los pueblos indígenas de Colombia, todos los pueblos indígenas que existen aquí en este planeta, el gobierno no se ha reconocido como pueblos indígenas.
Our position as indigenous people is that we must one day tell the world that those of you that accompany us, that we need your solidarity, but not just for the Uwa people or the indigenous people of Colombia, but for all the indigenous peoples of the world who are not recognized as such.
A nombre del desarrollo, quieren matar a nosotros, quieren destruir nuestra cultura.
In the name of development, they want to kill us. They want to destroy our culture.
Para el gobierno, para las compañías multinacionales, es un desarrollo, pero para los pueblos indígenas es una destrucción cultural, destrucción ambiental y social, y la contaminación que deja con la explotación petroleras.
For the government, for the multinationals, they call it development. For the indigenous people, it's our cultural and environmental and social destruction, and it also brings with it all the pollution that oil exploration and exploitation always does.
Tenemos experiencia en Colombia con la explotación de caño limón, que lleva 25 años de explotación. Fueron destruidos unas comunidades indígenas guaíbos, se perdió sus territorios, hoy se encuentra en las calles del mismo departamento de Arauca. Eso es un desarrollo para el gobierno, para las compañías, para nosotros fue se murió cultura indígena y destruyó unas comunidades indígenas y hoy no tienen derecho a la tierra.
We can look at what happened in Caño Limón. In the last 25 years, they've been exploiting oil there, and they destroyed the Waibo people. The Waibos lost their territory, and now they wander the streets of Auraca. This is what the development of the government and multinationals causes: cultural death, the destruction of our communities. It leaves our peoples without the right to our lands.
Eso es lo que quiere hacer con las comunidades indígenas uvas. En Arauca se dejó, es la violencia y la muerte.
This is what they also want to do to the Uwa people. We see clearly that in Arauca, the outcome was violence and death.
El Plan Colombia es un plan de muerte, es un plan de violencia para destruir a la sociedad.
Plan Colombia is a plan of death. It is a plan of violence to destroy the society.
Hoy, este año se aumenta 70% de los muertos todos los días en Colombia, sea indígenas, sea campesinos, sea dirigentes sindicatos, se mueren. Para ellos hay enemigos de la vida.
The death toll and the assassinations in Colombia have increased 70%, and the victims are the indigenous peoples, they're the campesinos, and they're the unionists. This is the death. This is what's occurring.
Plan Colombia es defender los intereses del gobierno, de los grandes terratenientes y de la compañía multinacional.
So Plan Colombia is for the defense, for defending the interests of the government and the multinationals and the landowners.
Como pobres campesinos o indígenas, no se va a beneficiar de ese recurso de Plan Colombia.
The poor, the campesinos, and the indigenous peoples are not going to see any of the benefits of the funds from Plan Colombia.
Por eso nosotros estamos en contra de la política del gobierno.
That's why we oppose the policy of the government.
Y con esta pequeña exposición quiero pedirle a ustedes la solidaridad, el apoyo de ustedes, que nos apoye. Esto necesita apoyos internacionales. Nosotros solo no podemos hacer, porque hace rato el señor presidente decía, es una guerra declarada. Para prevenir hay que intervenir los derechos humanitarios internacionales, porque nosotros solos no somos capaces de evitar esta guerra. Gracias.
So with this small speech, I'd like to call upon you to offer us your solidarity, to offer us your support. Support us. We need the international support. We cannot do it alone. As the president of ONIC, Armando, just said, war has been declared. Please help us defend our rights.
At this moment, we can open up for questions for any one of the three speakers. Please stand up and make sure that everybody can hear you, because we don't have a microphone to pass around. Oh, I guess we do. Does this microphone work? Oh, good. I'm sorry. I didn't see those. Great.
I have a question. I would just like to understand more about the strategies that the UA and other indigenous people in Colombia are pursuing, the modes of struggle, and who are your main allies, both in Colombia and elsewhere in Latin America.
Hace algunas semanas, en el área del Pacífico, por los lados de Panamá, vive el pueblo Vega.
In the Pacific area near Panama, the Imbera people live.
Este es un pueblo por donde va a atravesar un megaproyecto que es el canal interoceánico más abajo de Panamá.
Where the Imbera people live, a mega project is proposed. This is the interoceanic channel, canal, which will be to the south of the Panama Canal.
El ejército colombiano, sus
not allowing food supply to reach the Embera,
lo cual causa un efecto y es la muerte de los ancianos y los niños.
which is causing the death of the elders and the children.
Como forma de resistencia para la vida, se está educando a los niños cuáles eran las antiguas semillas de los alimentos para no bajar a las áreas urbanas, sino mantenerse los más adentro de la selva con esas semillas que se utilizaban en el pasado.
So one of the Embera's forms of resistance, given the situation, is a resistance for life. And what they're doing is they're educating their children about how historically they've always eaten the seeds. And this allows them to stay in the jungle and not have to leave to get other forms of food.
Es un ejemplo de una forma de resistencia de un pueblo.
This is a small example of a form of resistance of a people.
Los Uwa, sus aliados principales, son los campesinos que viven a su lado hace muchos años.
The Uwa have amongst their principal allies the campesinos, who are their neighbors.
Y el proceso pedagógico del pueblo Uwa con los campesinos es que resistan y no le vendan esas tierras en las que ellos viven ni a las multinacionales, ni a las fuerzas de derecha, ni al gobierno.
And one of the ways that the Uwa and the campesinos are resisting is by not selling their lands, not to the multinationals or the right-wing groups or to the government itself.
Son alianzas fraternales y alianzas de resistencia de Uwas y campesinos.
These are fraternal alliances. These are alliances of the campesinos and the Uwa.
Algunos campesinos franceses también apoyan al pueblo Uwa.
Some French campesinos or farmers also support the Uwa.
El movimiento obrero internacional también está apoyando a los Uwa.
Also, the international union movement is also supporting the Uwa.
Las organizaciones no gubernamentales de derechos humanos en los Estados Unidos también están apoyando al pueblo Uwa.
And the organizations of human rights and the NGOs in the United States are also supporting the Uwa.
Estoy convencido de que personalidades de la humanidad como Noam Chomsky también está apoyando a los Uwa.
And I'm also convinced that many celebrities and renowned personalities of humanity like Mr. Noam Chomsky are also supporting the Uwa.
Y ustedes también,
And you as well.
porque estos lazos son cada vez más fuertes cuando ustedes u otras partes conocen lo que es Colombia y lo que es el pueblo Uwa, no lo que dicen los medios de comunicación, es el contacto humano nuestro.
And these links grow stronger every time you learn more about Colombia, when you learn about the Uwa people, and you learn not what the media is telling you, but really what is happening. This strengthens our...
Es una de las más grandes experiencias que tiene el pueblo Uwa.
This is one of the strongest, greatest sources of strength for the Uwa people.
Just bend over.
So, our government told us, this question is for you gentlemen here, and
nos dijo,
for Noam
bueno,
separately.
la pregunta es para ustedes dos y luego
When our government was passing through the $1.7 billion, I think is that correct?
bueno, cuando el gobierno
Colombia,
aprobó el
one of the things that
1.7
was being
billones de
said was
dólares
that
de Plan
the
Colombia,
paramilitary and
una de
the
las
Colombian
cosas que
military,
dijeron es
which
que los
apparently historically had
paramilitares
many alliances do not have those alliances anymore.
Tuvieron muchas alianzas, ya no cuentan con esas alianzas. Lo dudo cuando lo escuché, pero quisiera saber lo que dicen ustedes sobre los aliados de los paramilitares. Y quiere copia de un documento que citó el profesor. Ya, usted va a contestar la pregunta sobre los aliados de los paramilitares.
Yo aquí tengo un documento guía que pasado mañana en una reunión con el gobierno de Suecia en Estocolmo, las organizaciones sociales, la organización guerrillera FARC, el Ejército de Liberación Nacional y el gobierno colombiano van a reflexionar 2 días.
I have a document here which is a background document which will be used in a dialogue and reflection of 2 days that will be held in Stockholm between the civilian society, the guerrilla movement of Colombia, the FARC and the ELN, and the government of Colombia.
Y les voy a mencionar 2 preguntas que vamos a hacer allá.
And I'd like to tell you 2 of the questions that we're going to put forward in that discussion.
Los generales, coroneles y capitanes que apoyan
Sí.
los generales, coroneles y capitanes que apoyan, permiten y promueven el paramilitarismo, que son la mayoría, van a gozar de buen retiro. Los viejos y nuevos partidos tradicionales están de acuerdo con que haya perdón y olvido con los militares.
So the first question is, are the generals, colonels, and captains that support and allow and promote the paramilitary, which are the majority of generals, colonels, and captains, are they all going to enjoy a cushy retirement? Are the old and new traditional parties that in agreement with the idea that we should just forgive and forget?
Es esta una pregunta porque cada día la presencia paramilitar de los oficiales activos es mayor, pero también los oficiales del ejército que están destituyendo están pasando de manera oficial, entre comillas, a los paramilitares.
This is a key question because each day we're seeing that the presence of the paramilitary groups grows. And we're also seeing that the officials of the army that get fired or laid off are getting work in the paramilitary groups.
En Colombia todos sabemos que es mayor la presencia paramilitar.
In Colombia, everybody knows that the presence of the paramilitary is just growing.
If I can just add a word to that, because
Quisiera añadir un comentario a
had a
eso.
look at the newspapers the last couple of
Leí
days.
los periódicos de
There
los
wasn't
últimos
much, but
días.
there was a report of a major
Hubo un
massacre
artículo sobre una
2 or 3 days ago.
matanza.
Maybe 100 people were
De 100
killed.
personas.
People were cut to pieces with chainsaws.
Cortaron a la gente con motosierras,
Paramilitary
que es,
device.
esa es una
There's an
técnica
army
de los
base right there's none of the
paramilitares.
paramilitaries. There's an army base right nearby.
Hay una base militar muy cerca, pero no hicieron nada.
They didn't try to impede
No
it. They didn't
trataron de
investigate.
parar la matanza, no han hecho una investigación.
What does it take to
¿De qué
convince
se
people that
requiere para
there's a
convencer a la
linkage?
gente
There's no doubt in
que hay un
anyone's mind
nexo entre el ejército y el paramilitar, no incluye los grupos paramilitares eran establecidos como una agencia del ejército y los Estados Unidos tienen una gran responsabilidad en eso. En el 62, bajo la administración de Kennedy, como parte de su compromiso general para masacrar, envió una misión militar de los boinas verdes. Un general sugirió al ejército de Colombia
rely on what he called paramilitary terror against the phrase was known communist proponents.
Paramilitar en contra de los comunistas, los sindicalistas.
In fact, anybody who gets in the way. And the U.S. didn't just give advice, it gave training, arms, and so on, and it continues up to the present. And there's, the last year, if you like, there were extensive reports by Human Rights Watch and the United Nations. The State Department Human Rights Watch is reports, doesn't doubt it, they make a big speech about it. They're very close, and if you look at incident after incident, like the one that happened a couple of days ago, you see it. In fact, if you take a look at the strategy of the Plan Colombia, it's really a Washington plan, not a Bogota plan. It's aimed at the territories of the people who are in the way, not the paramilitaries. Your second question is extremely easy to answer. The text of the FTAA, there's no way to get it unless you happen to be a high official of IBM or some other major corporation who's involved in it, or you happen to be working in an editorial office of the major newspapers, because they surely have it. But it has been very purposely kept from the public domain. And remember, this has been going on the negotiations have been going on for several years. The last January was the date for, there are a lot of working committees. The working committees were supposed to submit their drafts last January. It's now being more or less ratified. During this entire period, including this moment, the text has not been made available. They keep saying someday they will, and I suppose someday they will when it's irrelevant. But you can learn a lot about it. You can learn a lot about it from people who've investigated the statements of government leaders, particularly in Canada, and have looked at the workings of the committee's parts. Pieces of them are out. You can find bits and pieces of them on the web. And there's some good books about it. There's a good, mostly by Canadians. There's a good book by Maud Barlow, who's, I forget the name, but some analysis of the FTAA based on considerable material. And we know pretty much what it is. There's not a big secret. It's a combination of the harshest parts of NAFTA and the World Trade Organization agreement, with the difference between them. They're picking the harshest part. It's including the multilateral agreement on investments, which was defeated because of public protest a couple of years ago and is now being sneaked in other fashions. It's also including the incorporating and probably extending what's going on in Geneva right now, and has been for several years, also in secret, the meetings of on the General Agreement of on Trade and Services, which has the character that I described. That also hasn't been made public, but there's been enough leakage so you know what's in it. There's a book by a Canadian specialist, Stuart Friedman, I think his name is, Sinclair, on that, and plenty of literature, but you have to search. You have to be in the. One of the reasons why Ralph Nader is so constantly denounced, again this morning in the Times, is because his organizations have been releasing this material, and that's very bad, because it might mean that some parts of the public might learn what's happening to them. You got to make sure that doesn't happen.
question specifically about Occidental Petroleum. I keep hearing the company's name come up again and again, and when I'm at the pump filling up or what have you, I always wonder, because I have to admit I'm totally ignorant about the company, where they're located, what exactly, what gas companies they sell to, whatever. And I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the company itself. And also, I realize, oil companies aren't exactly the most environmentally conscious firms in the world, to put it mildly. But are there some that are better than others? Are there some that you see emerging as leaders, or are they pretty much across the board just, out to exploit and make a profit? So if you could just touch upon those two, give me a little bit of background on Occidental, that'd be great.
Primero, nosotros no estamos escogiendo, mirando si es mejor o es más mejor que el otro, sino que nosotros estamos reclamando al gobierno que respetara lo que es la cultura, lo que es el derecho. Que nosotros no estamos hablando si es el mejor, no, sino que respete lo que es el derecho, lo que es la propiedad de los pueblos indígenas. Nosotros tenemos nuestra propiedad sobre la tierra y sobre el subsuelo. Es un concepto que ya técnicamente de acuerdo a nuestra cultura, es un concepto técnico de acuerdo a nuestra cultura. Dos, si hay, pues yo creo que todas las compañías que hacen operaciones en Colombia, todo es igual. Porque las mismas compañías se han llevado a crear la violencia. Y me explico, se han creado grupos paramilitares donde hay explotación petrolera. Ellos pagan, ellos financian los grupos paramilitares, entonces no hay nada mejor si la OPSI o otras compañías que operan en Colombia, todos son iguales. Todo destruye destrucción ambiental, todos se contaminan. No hay una tecnología que se puede controlar. De acuerdo a nuestro pensamiento, que la compañía no es capaz de controlar, porque cuando inicia la operación, cuando inicia la exploración, ya está atentando contra nuestra madre tierra, ya están contaminando. Eso es el concepto como pueblo indígena Cuba.
Firstly, I'd like to say that we're not looking at if Occidental is better or worse than other oil companies. We are just demanding that the government respect our culture and their own laws and our property as Indigenous people. Both the land and the subsurface are our property in our technical and traditional concept of land. Now, as far as the other oil companies in Colombia go, I think they're all just as bad as each other. They all cause violence. And let me explain myself. They all create paramilitary groups. They pay the paramilitary groups, they bankroll them, and so there's really not one that's better or worse than the other. They're all terrible. They all destroy the environment. They all pollute. And none of them have the technology to control or really seriously mitigate that. So according to us, they're just not capable of doing oil exploration without hurting Mother Earth and without polluting.
My question is, what can I do as an ordinary U.S. citizen, college student, do to help, hinder Occidental or, just basically support you more than just, I feel your pain, like actually doing something?
siento su dolor y quiero hacer.
Kim Foster, who's one of the main organizers of this tour, is going to wrap up in maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and she'll answer that question directly. Okay. Paul, did you want to ask your question, and then we'll wrap up and move to Kim?
Yes, Paul Boyle, semester Chapter of Ethics for Peace. I'd like to direct this question to Professor Noam Chomsky. The School of Americas is training Latin American soldiers that go to Colombia. And the revolving door of the military is releasing major officers into the ministry groups that are now in Colombia. Those are the people that are carrying out America's strategy, not the government. They're isolated because they're mercenaries, they're doing it. The mercenaries are in the employ of these oil companies. Would you address how we, the people of the United States, can become active to stop this erosion of our power by the corporate purchase of our military?
You're talking about the mercenary organizations in the United States of retired military officers and so on. Yeah, there's been a fair amount of privatization of state terror in the last couple of years. You could say it's kind of part of the neoliberal program. So the British are probably in the lead in this. I mean, their record is mind-boggling. But the United States is doing it too. We have they're not really paramilitaries. They're former military, obviously closely linked to the military, who have companies that are hired to do military work, and they're usually funded by the U.S. government. So, in fact, if the U.S. government wants to stop them, it's over in 30 seconds. So what we can do is what we can always do, get the government to stop carrying out these activities. Notice there's nothing new about it. So during the 1980s, for example, the Reagan administration clearly intended around 1981 to follow the model of John F. Kennedy 20 years earlier when he invaded South Vietnam. Now, he got away with it. There was no objection to that. And they tried to duplicate what he was doing almost step by step in 1981, you know, white paper, media campaign, whole story. But there was an unanticipated popular reaction. The country is different in 1980 than it was in 1960. And there was a strong reaction around the country. They had to back off. And instead of just invading, say, Nicaragua and El Salvador the way, and Guatemala the way the U.S. invaded South Vietnam in the early 60s, what they turned to clandestine terror. Clandestine is a word that means everybody knows about it except the population of the United States. The media know, you know, the people involved know, the victims know, every other country knows, but it's kind of like the FTAA is clandestine. You got to make sure that people of the United States don't find out about it. And they hired mercenaries. But the United States is not like Libya. You know, like maybe if Libya wants to carry out terrorism, they hire some you know, Carlos or somebody, some person. The United States is a big operator. When we carry out terrorist activities, clandestine terrorist activities, we hire terrorist states. So what they did is set up the world's greatest terror network in history, consisting of terrorist states. It included Britain, as always, Taiwan, Israel, Argentina, as long as it was in the hands of Argentine neo-Nazis, when they unfortunately had a democratic revolution and overthrew the neo-Nazi regime. They didn't play anymore. Saudi Arabia to fund it. Yeah, this is a big international terror network. And you know, that by comparison, the military groups you're talking about are a very serious business, but they're not on that scale. Yeah, it's what states do. And they could get away with it in the 80s because it was kind of undercover. It was, as I said, clandestine. People didn't know much about it. You had to work to find it out. And the same's true now. You know about it, but a lot of other people don't. And if they did, they'd stop it. We can stop it. Just like we can stop Plan Colombia. A Plan Colombia is a plan that does not come from Bogota. It comes from Washington. Yeah, it can be stopped by activism here. Most of these things, if we get involved in it, we can really stop them. And the Reagan administration had to be driven underground, but it could have been stopped.
Aún la guerra cubierta Bueno, ahora ¿quién va a hablar de las actividades concretas que se
Did that answer that question? I think we have two, a question that was addressed to Roberto and Armando about activism
sobre
or how people can get involved to support the college
las medidas
campuses
concretas que se pueden hacer
and communities.
que las acciones concretas que se puede hacer entre apoyo a ustedes. ¿Qué cosas concretas se puede hacer? ¿Ustedes pueden contestar? ¿O que la
Armando va a contestar?
¿Usted va a contestar?
Sí, mire, nosotros todavía no tenemos una propuesta alternativa para la defensa del territorio. Uno, nosotros encontramos débil en capacidad de organización, que es el primer punto. Nosotros como pueblo indígena de Colombia tenemos que unificar unos criterios de defensa del territorio. No hablaríamos solamente del territorio de los UAS, sino acaba de mencionar Armando Balbuena el problema con los indígenas, con Emberá. Entonces, de eso tenemos que unificar criterios para poder tomar una propuesta clara en defensa del territorio de los pueblos indígenas de Colombia, porque todos los recursos energéticos se encuentran en territorios indígenas, en todos los territorios indígenas. Entonces tenemos que organizar, consolidar más y también a nivel nacional en Colombia buscar una unidad, alianza con otros sectores no indígenas como sector estudiantil, sectores campesinos, sectores populares. Tenemos gente que podrían apoyar por vía de hechos en movilizaciones. Entonces yo creo que aquí también conformar unos grupos de apoyos, de solidaridad, desde aquí se puede hacer. Esto también es hacer una reflexión, ustedes mismos se pueden analizar y presionar más que todo aquí al gobierno de estadounidenses y presionar a la compañía multinacional que es Oxy, que es el que se va de aquí a estos países a hacer daños a otros países. Entonces yo creo que esa es la forma como ir buscando unas alternativas. Aquí hay grupos de apoyos que vienen colaborando hace 4 años, pues con ellos se pueden contactar y se pueden colaborar con ellos.
We're working on alternative proposals for the defense of our territories. We still need to strengthen our organizational capacity. And we're talking about not just the defense of the territory of the Uwa people, but the defense of the territories of all the indigenous peoples of Colombia. So amongst ourselves, we need to arrive at a consensus about the criteria for the defense of our territories. Armando mentioned the struggle of the Embera people. You know, there are many indigenous people that need to come together. So remembering that all of the energy resources tend to be in our territories, we need to continue to organize and to consolidate our work. And also we need to unite with non-Indigenous people and forge alliances with students, with the popular movement, with the unionists, and so that they can support our struggle and our mobilizations. Well, what can you do? Well, you might want to think about forming support groups of the UWA people or solidarity committees. I invite you to reflect on that possibility and to analyze its viability. Obviously, we need to pressure the government of the United States. We need to pressure Occidental Petroleum because it's a company that goes to other countries and wreaks havoc. So let's take a look at the alternatives. I invite you to do that. There are groups that have already been working for the last 4 years in solidarity with you, and I invite you to contact them and collaborate with them. Speaking of which,
are there any other burning desires for any more questions? Maybe there's one more chance for people to...
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Okay, go.
Yes.
Use the microphone, please. It's right there.
Quiere que use el micrófono.
We want to hear you. Thank you.
Voy a hablar en español y me hace favor y traduce. Bueno, el problema de las multinacionales en Colombia es muy grave. Ustedes no se alcanzan tal vez a imaginar la destrucción. Por ejemplo, en el estado de donde yo soy, que es el Valle del Cauca, hay una multinacional que está explotando el oro en la parte alta del río Guavas. En ese lugar están usando mercurio y cianuro. Todos esos químicos van al agua y han destruido todos los pescados totalmente, todos. La gente está muy enferma porque el agua con esos químicos la toman, los niños están enfermos, gente enferma de los ojos. Es terrible. Y los paramilitares están acelerados, matando gente por toda parte. ¿Por qué? Porque en esas tierras las multinacionales están interesadas en que todos los campesinos abandonen esas tierras y ellos se apoderen. Hay más o menos 10.000 campesinos desplazados en esa región. Y esta historia no es solamente en el valle, es en todo Colombia. Ahora, yo les pido, si de pronto envían los helicópteros a Colombia, yo les pediría a ustedes misericordia por todos los colombianos, que vayan mucha gente a estarse donde van a bombardear, a ver si se puede evitar esa situación, porque es terrible y es muy doloroso.
The problem of the multinationals in Colombia is very grave. An example of this is in the Valle de la Cauca, where multinationals that are exploiting gold have poisoned the rivers with cyanide and mercury, and this is killing the fish and causing sickness in the people, especially the children, and all sorts of eye diseases, and they also creating paramilitary groups and terror. Why is this going on? Because the multinationals want to force the campesinos out of their land. There are already 10,000 campesinos displaced from this region itself. But this isn't just happening in La Cauca, it's happening in all of Colombia. So I call upon you to show mercy in the event that helicopters are sent to Colombia and they start to drop bombs to protest this.
There was one question that wasn't really answered on the American side of things, and that's to do with Occidental Petroleum, which is based in LA. And most of the oil is being refined in Louisiana, usually in the communities of color. And it's also being used to make PVC plastic. And so there's Patrick Greensboro over there for Rainforest Action Network. And do you have any other information about that you'd like to add?
Just to let folks know that Occidental doesn't have gas stations. This is why they've been so resistant to this campaign. They believe that because they don't do business directly with consumers, that they can get away with engaging the genocide of the Uwa people. But as a lot of folks here know, there's been an incredible international solidarity movement to show them that we'll hold them accountable regardless of that. But to let people know that all of the oil companies, every oil company is involved in the destruction of the environment, the systematic violation of human rights, and the genocide of indigenous people. So the question here isn't about choosing between oil companies. The question is about how do we get our society off of oil, and how do we hold the oil companies accountable for what they're doing. To that end, and Kim will talk about it a little bit more, there's an effort to accept that we're a society that's addicted to oil and to go after the drug pushers. The best way that we can hit these oil companies is to go after the financiers, to go after Wall Street. Oil is an incredibly lucrative business, and a lot of people are making a lot of money. A lot of corporations are making a lot of money off of human rights abuses and environmental destruction around the world. From Nigeria to Uwa territories, Indonesia to the Arctic, it's all the same story. So the campaign to support the Uwa people has been particularly powerful in going after Fidelity Investments, based right here in Boston, who was the largest shareholder in Occidental Petroleum. Because of international grassroots pressure, that is no longer true. So Kim will talk a little bit more about some of the work that's been happening, but bear in mind that there are no good oil companies out there. There are plenty of alternatives. There's no way to put a meter on the sun, and the only reason we haven't gotten around to running our society on wind power, on solar power, is because the oil corporations and the people that profit from them are standing in the way.
And there is an initiative here at MIT to move beyond just conservation of energy and to actually implement some alternative energies here on campus. So people definitely should sign up on the list out there to be contacted. Also, there is, on this tour, we're going to really be highlighting the corporate profiteers of Plan Colombia, mainly the weapons manufacturers here in the Northeast. And people can directly get involved right now to support the UWA. We're going to be going to Sikorsky for a vigil at 6:30 in Stratton, Connecticut, if people are interested. Also, Roberto is going to be speaking at the Textron shareholders meeting in Providence, Rhode Island on Wednesday. And this is leading up to a National Day of Action at Sanford Bernstein, based in New York City. So if folks can get on a bus or rent a van and bring some of your schoolmates down, that would be great to be in solidarity with Roberto and the UWA. And also, we'll be joining the Dene, which are protesting at Lehman Brothers, and we're going to be walking to Wall Street after that in solidarity. So there's a lot of things that you can get involved with. Most importantly, too, is to make sure that the Bush administration knows about the UWA struggle. A lot of us were very active in the Gore campaign and making sure that he knew that we knew about his secrets and his deep personal, political, and financial ties to Occidental. And so I think too that a lot of people should be really proud of yourselves. I see a lot of familiar faces out there, people who have been at Fidelity over and over, people who went to Gore demonstrations at all of his campaign headquarters here. And it was a big victory having Fidelity divest about over 60% of their stock. Right now, Occidental's stock is $10 less than it should be, which sends a pretty strong message that Occidental is being viewed as a risky investment. And that's why we really need to keep up the pressure. Occidental, they're the largest investor is Sanford Bernstein, and their parent company is Alliance Capital. They have a lot of pension funds and also state loans, especially in the state of Rhode Island. So that's why another reason we're going to Brown and going to the community there to talk about that. Again, we're still putting pressure on Fidelity to divest the rest of their Oxy stock. So please check your investments. And most important too, it's really important, to that Roberta did talk about, and the question was brought up about what you can do on campus, because there is a lot, and we really need school groups forming in all the campuses, especially here in Boston when there's so many institutions here. So please come up afterwards. We're going to have a small discussion circle to talk about solidarity even after the UL leaves, and how we can continue the momentum and build the campaign here in the Northeast, and especially build the movement against Plan Colombia, because especially in the last 3 months, people have been really coming together in coalition against this, and we are making a lot of progress, and we are breaking the silence about the corporations who are profiting, like Sikorsky and Textron. And so we really can make a difference. And there's lots of different groups that you can get involved with. Check out the tables. Also, too, tomorrow there is going to be a demonstration at the Canadian consulate. We have to remember, to our brothers and sisters who are up there fighting for democracy and for us. They're up in Quebec, and I think it's listed right up there. Also tomorrow, or this whole week, kicks off a Northeast Global Alternatives Conference, where we're going to be talking about a lot of alternatives to globalization and how we can really make these alternatives real in our own communities, especially here in Boston. Tomorrow night, we're going to be at, there's been a change in the schedule, we're going to be in East Boston, and actually Ignacio Gomez is going to be speaking about the effects of the drug war on peoples in Colombia from a journalist perspective and his experiences of 20 years being a journalist. And then also Streets Are Watching is going to be presenting there, an amazing group doing really good work over in Roxbury, fighting the prison industrial complex and also police brutality, and making the connections between who the drug war is really affecting here in our urban communities, and that is people of color. So please come out to that event. There's information out on the table. And also a very important struggle here is the struggle for Leonard Peltier and his freedom. So please check out the tables out there. And thank you again to Mr. Noam Chomsky for coming out tonight, and also to Armando, who's come. He went through very many hurdles to get here at the very last minute, and it was a real special treat to have him coming from his village in North Colombia all the way to Bogota and then here to the U.S., and also Roberto, who has come from his home in the rainforest all the way here to give us his words. And I hope that you allow their words to really stay in your hearts and your minds. And now that you're armed with the truth, and that makes you very powerful, that please take action on this. And please get involved, and please come and talk to us, and talk to the community, and just spread their message and about protecting the earth. This is Earth Week, and we will culminate in our activities this whole tour at Earth Day, and that's going to be at the Hat Shell where Roberto will be speaking.